Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in a minute. It's 1 o'clock on a Thursday. Hello. I know people are still coming in, so we'll just wait another minute. I have to say, I missed all of you. Even though I don't see your faces every week when we do this, I've started to learn your voices, that's for sure. But last week I had a funeral at the same time as this session, so obviously I could not do this session. And so I missed it. Just preparing and thinking about today, I was thinking, oh my God, it feels like it's been so long since we've been together. So I'm glad we're back. Um, Technically, this is the 15th week. It's the 14th session since we had to miss last week, but it's the 15th week of this stay-at-home learning. So it's pretty incredible that we're still going strong. There's still lots of stories in the Talmud. I think I already have my story for next week picked out. Um, Based on a little piece of this story. So much more for us to explore. Um, yeah, doing the funeral last week. I think it's the third one I've done since we started this stay-at-home orders, and some things have stayed the same. I would say now more people are attending those funerals, even though it's still very limited. Um, and and it's a weird experience, really weird to be with masks and to be socially distant, just at graveside. There were family members who were on Zoom, so it was a mix of people on Zoom and in person. Anyway, it's a whole new world. But as I've said before, still some really meaningful opportunities. And another thing this week, I delivered 2 Torahs to families who have children who are becoming B'nai Mitzvah this weekend. And that's very special because it's one thing to show up on the day of your Bar Bat Mitzvah and the Torah is there and it's in the Ark. It's different, I would say, even from my experience as a clergy person, to be able to literally deliver a Torah to someone outside their home, and the fact that they're going to have the Torah in their home for a few days or up to a week before, and then of course a few days after their bar bat mitzvah. And at the synagogue, we put together a little guide, not only how people should care for the Torah when it's in their home, but various activities that they can do with the Torah, like hold the Torah and go into all the bedrooms and all the common areas of your house, and as a family, offer a blessing of what you want in that space. So those are things that can't happen usually when the Torah is only in the Ark. So there's some really wonderful things that I think are happening with Jewish ritual that are coming out of this whole process. So anyway, wonderful to have you all. We're going to get started. Just a reminder of our Zoom protocol for this webinar setting, which is different than a meeting setting. You are all going to have the opportunity to share your thoughts at the end after we go through this text together. So we'll go through it, I'll share some thoughts, and then I'll open it up for people to virtually raise their hand to offer their own comments or reflections or thoughts or questions, whatever it may be. So you'll see that if you're in the Zoom, this is being streamed onto Facebook too. So if you're on Facebook, you can type in a question and someone behind the scenes will hopefully get that to me so I can answer it. You'll see there's a chat button. There is a Q&A button on Zoom, and then you can also, if you open the participants panel, you can virtually raise your hand, and that's probably the best way when we get to the discussion section for me to call on you, and then I can unmute you and you can share your thoughts. Always some phenomenal thoughts and perspectives in this group. So let's begin with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for giving us this opportunity to engage in the study of Torah. Amen. Today, we are looking at another cave story, the second session that we did together. And I don't know how many of you were here for the second session, so I'm actually going to review the first cave story very briefly before we get into the second one. But that was right at the start of staying at home, and this idea of the cave had significance, as you can imagine. And you can go back, if you go to our website under the WBT at Home link, and then you go under study resources. You can find all of the Talmud Tales source sheets from the very first one all the way to today, and you can download those and keep them and review them on your own. But if you go to the second one, you will find the first cave story that we studied together. And today we're going to look at a different one. We're going to look at one that comes from the Jerusalem Talmud. Yerushalmi is another name for it. Usually we spend most of our time focusing on the Babylonian Talmud, also called the Bavli. That's usually used as the prominent Talmud by which we make decisions where halacha is decided. That's the go-to for most study of Talmud. But there is this Jerusalem Talmud, which was written, they think, around 400 CE, whereas the Babylonian Talmud is considered around 600 CE. The Babylonian Talmud was done, of course, in Babylonia, in exile, and goes a little bit more in depth. One thing during my research that I found that I really liked the way that described the difference between the Jerusalem or Yerushalmi and the Bavli is that the Yerushalmi is really about the what. It's really about what are the halacha, what are the rules. You know, as you remember, the Talmud is made up of the Mishnah, which is the Jewish law code, and then the commentary on that. And that's really what establishes the Talmud. The Yerushalmi focuses, the Jerusalem Talmud focuses more on the halacha and is pretty succinct and to the point for the most part, whereas the Babylonian Talmud goes into more depth, more detail, more conversation. So whereas the Jerusalem Talmud is more about the what, the Babylonian Talmud is more about the how, it's about the process. So it's a little bit more like a journey. And so that's been used, and it's a little bit more comprehensive. But there are some interesting stories that are found in the Jerusalem Talmud. We just don't study them so much. So today we're looking at a version of the story that we found in session 2, but this time it's in the Jerusalem Talmud. So really quickly, we are going to have to go find the one from session 2 so we can review it really quickly. We are going to first just quickly review the first text that we studied a long time ago, and then we're going to really focus on the one that I sent you guys for today. Okay, so let me just pull this up, and then again afterwards we'll have the chance to debrief and talk about it. Okay, so this is just really briefly what happened in the first session that we did together. Or sorry, the second. He, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who we're going to see in this story as well, went with his son and hid in the Beit Midrash, and each day his wife brought him bread and a jug of water, and they ate. When the decree became more severe, he said to his son, "Women are easy-minded, they may abuse her, and she will reveal us." They went and they hid in a cave. A miracle happened. A carob tree and a spring of water were created for them. They took off their clothes and sat up to their necks in sand. All day they sat and studied, and when the time came to pray, they got out of the sand, dressed their bodies, covered their heads, and prayed, and again took off their clothes, all in order that they may not wear out. They dwelled in the cave for 12 years. Elijah came to the opening of the cave, saying, "Who will inform Bar Yochai that the emperor died and the decree is annulled?" So they went out. They saw men plowing and sowing, and Rabbi Shimon said, "They forsake eternal life and busy themselves with temporal life." Every place they turned their eyes to was immediately burned. A heavenly voice came out and said to them, "Did you go out to destroy my world? Return to your cave." And so they returned. They dwelled there for 12 months, saying, "The sentence of the wicked in hell is 12 months." A heavenly voice went out and said, "Go out from your cave." They went out. Wherever his son Rabbi Elazar smote, Rabbi Shimon healed. He said, "My son, you and I are sufficient for the world." When the eve of the Sabbath arrived, they saw a certain old man who was holding two bunches of myrtle running at twilight. They said to him, "Why do you need these?" He said to them, "To honor the Shabbat." They said, "Would not one suffice for you?" He said, "One for remember the Sabbath and one for observe the Sabbath." Rabbi Shimon said to him, his son, "See how dear is a commandment to Israel?" And Rabbi Elazar's mind was set at ease. Okay, that's the Babylonian version of the story that we are now going to look at a Jerusalem version, which is much more simplified. And I don't want to spend too much time comparing and contrasting. We could do that. I really instead want to focus, that I just gave you so you can have a little bit of context. I want us to focus on this story And especially given where we are now, that we have been in the caves, so to speak, for weeks and weeks, and people, whether they should or not, are coming out in full force out of their homes, and some are wearing masks, some are not. We've been seeing in the news in the last couple of days the peaks that are coming in certain states, and the fact that now New Jersey and Connecticut and New York have put a 14-day quarantine on people who come and visit their states. So we're seeing a different type of spike. So the cave, I think, is taking on a different significance now, especially given the fact that also in these last couple of weeks, everything that has come out because of the murder of George Floyd and all of the racial injustice and the systemic racism that has been brought to the surface once again, and the protests and a different sense of what it means to be coming out of the cave. So I feel like today, the reason I wanted to talk about that cave is because I think we're all now in a different place than when we first entered that cave weeks and weeks ago. Where we are individually, where are we as a society, and what does it mean for us to move forward? And what is the message that we can gather from the text that we're about to look at for our own lives and for our society as we continue to come out of this cave, the multiple caves that we are in? Okay, so again, as we're studying this, think about who are the characters, what resonates with you, what questions does this raise, and what is your interpretation of how this text can be relevant in your own personal life and how it can be relevant in the world in which we're living right now. That's really the purpose of all of this that we're studying together. Okay, so with that, we will study the text, and then we will go and look at it in discussion. Okay, sorry, I'm 1 week off and I'm a little jittery. Okay, this one, Jerusalem Talmud, Shvi'it 9:1 from this manuscript. Okay, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai was hidden in a cave for 13 years, in a cave of cherubs in Truma until his body rusted. Just going to make it bigger so it's easier for everyone to see, if we can. That's not going to work so well. Sorry. Let me start again. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai was hidden in a cave for 13 years, in a cave of cherubs in Truma until his body rusted. At the end of the 13 years, he said, "Should I not go out to see what is new in the world?" He went out and sat by the mouth of the cave. He saw a hunter hunting a bird. The hunter laid out a trap. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai heard a heavenly voice that said, "Freed," and the bird flew off. He said, "If not for the will of heaven, a bird would not get trapped. All the more so is this true of human beings." That's the entire story. Okay, so now we're going to go back. I'm going to share some of my own thoughts and questions. I have a lot more questions than I have answers for this text. And then I really want us, and I want you to be thinking about what's his message at the very end. This idea, if not for the will of heaven, a bird would not get trapped. All the more so is this true of human beings, because that's really the ending of this passage. That's supposed to be the message that we're supposed to take from this. So I want you to be thinking about that as we now go back and look at it again. What do you take from this, right? What is the symbolism of all the different pieces of this story? Because I think we can look at this as a piece of literature where we can delve into the significance of each word almost, as we do with the Torah itself. And I think there's such beauty when we approach text in that way. Okay, so let's look at it one more time. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai was hidden in a cave for 13 years. Okay, so my first question is, what is he hiding from? There's a difference between going into a cave and thinking about this is a time to reflect purely without this sense of hiddenness. But here he was hidden in a cave. So I think one of the things that I'm thinking about in the context of our own lives right now is what has been, when you've been in this cave, when you've been in your home spending a lot of time, what has been hidden there? What have you been hiding up until this point? Are there certain things, yes, that have been revealed, but there is a sense that we have been hiding from this disease or protecting ourselves from this pandemic. And yet I also think the beauty of spending time at home is that there are certain things that have been revealed within ourselves. I can speak for myself. There's certain things that had been hidden for a long time that were revealed only by going into this cave-like experience. So the question is, what was he hiding from? What is the purpose of going into a cave in order to hide ourselves from something else? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? He goes into this cave for 13 years, okay? It's a significant amount of time. What was he searching for? Why would he go in for that long of a time? And what is the difference between going and hiding oneself for a short period of time and then coming out of that cave, out of that hiddenness, versus spending 13 years in that state? Okay, maybe we're going to get hints of what that means in the lines to come. In a cave of cherubs and truma until his body rusted. So this is the next question that this text raises for me. Why the word rusted? Is this because he grew weak from the stasis of just being in this cave, of having no exposure to the outside world, and there was this rusting that comes through the lack of movement, the lack of emotional, spiritual movement? Is that what's going on here? Is this, as you think about rust is really this when iron is chemically attacked by moist air, right? Where, or actually, the other definition that I found, which of rust, is especially as it's referencing these ideas of trees and being in this vegetative landscape, that rust is a fungal disease of plants that leads to reddish patches, right? So is it the sense that he has become so enmeshed in the cave and in the land in which he's living that he has become at one with that space to the point where he is being rusted, it's overtaking him? Regardless, there's a negative connotation that comes from the fact that he's been in this cave, it seems as though long enough, to the point where there are negative repercussions on his body, and probably we can imagine also on his mind, right? A rusty mind. The fact that you get so used to doing things a certain way that even within this cave, right, as we start to think about how we are emerging back into society, and I know I've talked about this idea a lot, but I don't think we can talk about it enough. What does it mean to go out? What have we gotten so used to? Where have you yourself become rusty by being in your home for the last 15 weeks? What has been missing? What has been so commonplace and so routine that it's actually become detrimental? Because I think one of the very important things that we need to be thinking about right now is, yes, we have to focus on the things that have been really meaningful for us, but we also have to recognize the detrimental impacts of this. And that's why I think, of course, there are some people who are rushing to get out there and enter back into the world because they want to get that rust off their emotional and physical body, so to speak. But there is a challenge to that. So here we're getting the sense of there is something really powerful about being in that cave, and yet there's also something that can be very detrimental. And we know that, but it's clearly stating this in the story. At the end of 13 years, he said, "Should I not go out to see what is new in the world?" What is new in the world? Now, you can read this two ways. One, you could read this as he's finally realizing it's time for him to go out and see how the world has changed, because he's been in there for 13 years. And if we think about the fact that we haven't been in this state, thank God for that amount of time, but it's felt like a long period of time, we know that there are certain things that are new out in the world. All we have to do is look at the last few weeks with all the protests around the world, not just our country, that took place after the killing of George Floyd. And we recognize there is a new energy, there is a new desire for change to be occurring, right? And it's not just African Americans who are going out there, it's whites, it's everyone. There is this sense that things need to change. So in one sense, we can read this as there is a yearning for us to go out into the world and see what is new, right? Because when you feel rusted, when you feel like you're just doing the same thing over and over again, you need to find that newness. You need to find that spark. We need that. It's part of the human condition. Or is this about, should I not go out and see what is new in the world? In other words, what is new about him? Is this a question about what he is witnessing outside of himself? Or is this a recognition that we have changed, that he has changed over these 13 years? And going out into the world is not necessarily that the world has changed so much, but that our perspective has changed. And the newness is found deeply within our own transformation. And if we can capitalize on our own transformation, then the world starts to look different. Because the reality is, even with all the protests that have been going on, and even though there are changes that are happening in our society, as of now, there hasn't been so much on paper that has changed in our society, but our perspective is changing. And that's why people are going out and acting in a different way. So I think that this is really a statement, not about looking out and seeing how the world has changed, but how as we enter back into the world, as we start to emerge, how have we changed? What is new about us? Can we isolate those things? Can we articulate those things? And how can we use the newness of ourselves to bring about change in the world around us? Okay, so he goes out. He went out and sat by the mouth of the cave. Again, here we have him going out and he's sitting by the mouth of the cave. There's this concept of a liminal space. For example, an airport is a liminal space. It's a place where you travel through it. You don't put down roots in the airport. It is really a transitional location where from your home to a new location. And so the mouth of a cave is also a liminal space. It's an in-between space. So here, what is happening is he's going out and he's recognizing he sits by the mouth of the cave. You can't just jump back out into the world without recognizing that you need to slowly adjust to that world, because not only is the world looking a little different, but you're looking different and you're feeling different. And if you are going to bring the power of your newness and all the things that you have learned about yourself and about your family and about the world, if you are going to bring that out in the most productive way into the world around you, you can't just jump out there and expect that it's going to work perfectly. There's a value, I think, that this Talmud is this story is teaching us, of sit at that liminal space and recognize where you just came from inside that cave and where you're hoping to go. And if you can take a little bit of time to be in that space in between, you will be able to potentially transform into that new outer world in a different way, in a more productive way. So I think that that's a little teaching that we get from just that line. He saw a hunter hunting a bird. Okay. Um, why a bird? I was really trying to get nitpicky with the story because it's such a short story. So I was really trying to think about every single piece here. The bird, right? A bird. My first image that I thought of is when God says, "I am going to take you out as if on eagle's wings." Right? There's a passage in Exodus. This idea that our freedom as the Jewish people is brought about by God taking us as if on eagle's wings. Right? So here the bird is, I think, a symbolic representation of this idea of flight, of opportunity, of freedom, right? That this is what the bird is doing, and yet there is a hunter hunting that bird. We recognize that when we are trying to find freedom for ourselves, and when we as a society, as we are right now, looking to engage freedom and create freedom for all, there are always going to be hunters who are hunting down that freedom, right? There are going to be those, in this case, what is the hunter? Is the hunter someone who wants to maintain the order as it is, right? Because a hunter can be going out to make sure that populations don't get out of control and that they maintain the same population level of certain animals. Is this a hunter who's looking for power? Because there is a power in hunting and killing something else. There is an innate power that comes with that. What is the purpose of this hunter? And why is it that on the next line, the hunter laid out a trap? There are two ways. Actually, my wife and I just watched this great show called Alone on Netflix. Great show. We just watched the most recent season, which takes place in the Arctic. And these people, 12 people, are put out to survive as long as they can. And they're all naturalists, they're all survivalists. But there are two ways in which they hunt the animals in their midst. One is they go out and they use bows and arrows in the show, to go and hunt the game, or they use traps. Hunting with your bow and arrow takes a lot more energy, right? And that's an active way of hunting. A trap is a passive way of hunting. And here I think there's significance to the idea that the hunter is laying out a trap, that this is a passive form of killing. It's a passive form of getting in the way of freedom, right? It's as opposed to directly going out and destroying, it's a subtle way of trying to trap freedom. And if the bird represents freedom, if the bird represents opportunity, flight, the sky is the limit, so to speak, then a trap is a passive way that we can't always see that tries to diminish that freedom. And however you want to define those forces right now that exist, there are forces that have always existed. I think this this text is teaching us, and there will always be forces that are quietly trying to lay traps to make sure that things stay the way they are, even though we know that things are always in a state of change, that change is a significant part of growth, personal growth, communal growth. The entire Torah is a story about how we grow and we change and how we go from being enslaved to becoming free people. And if the bird is, in my mind, this representation of freedom and the opportunity for freedom and optimism, then the hunter and the traps are those elements that exist in our society, and sometimes the people in our society or in our own lives, that are setting up ways to try and make sure that that doesn't happen. And it's not always so in our face, that we have to be aware of those subtleties that exist around us, and I would say even within us, that are saying, no, keep things the way they are, stay in that cave. Things are a lot easier in the cave where you don't have to deal with the outside world. But if we are going to emerge from the cave and we are going to recognize what is new about us and to try and bring about change in the world around us, which is the Jewish way, then we have to be careful of those traps. So I think this is a teaching about try to be aware of what those traps are, because they're not always so clear. Okay, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai heard a heavenly voice that said, freed, and the bird flew off. And then he says, and this is the big line, and I'll go back to that freed line, where that the heavenly voice says, if not for the will of heaven, a bird would not get trapped. All the more so is this true of human beings. Okay, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. So a heavenly voice says freed, and the bird flew off. Now, there are two ways of reading this. One is that the heavenly voice says free in order to make sure that the bird doesn't get trapped, and then the bird flies off because the heavenly voice intercedes and makes sure that the bird doesn't get trapped. Another way to see it is that heavenly voice talking to the bird, or is that heavenly voice talking to Shimon ben Yochai and saying, you are free, right? It is giving him permission to no longer sit at the mouth of the cave, no longer to be in that liminal space between being engrossed in the cave and going out into the new world. This is God saying, Shimon, you are free, go out into the world. And it's giving him permission. Or is it this idea that God speaks and the bird is set free so that the hunter's power is taken away from the hunter, and the bird also has no control? It's really that God is in control. So this would be a theology that God is in control of everything that's happening and declares whether or not something good or bad happens. Some people have that theology, some don't. The wonderful thing about Judaism is there are a multitude of theologies that exist, and the God of the Jews represents God's self in a variety of ways throughout the Torah and throughout all kinds of rabbinic texts. So you still have the freedom to have your own theology exist within this framework. But then what's going on here? If not for the will of heaven, a bird would not get trapped. Okay, we'll start with that. In other words, it is God's will, it's heaven's will, that a bird does not get trapped, which we would assume then means that if a bird does get trapped, it is also God's will. All the more so is this true of human beings. In other words, if that is the case for birds, that God has control to make sure that the bird doesn't get trapped, God has that control in making sure that we don't get trapped as well. So is this just about God plays a role in our lives directly? Is that what this is teaching? Is this that God is declaring that we should all feel and be safe, and that Ben Yochai maybe misunderstood what was happening, that this wasn't about the bird being freed, but this is really a story about him being given permission to be freed? Is this that God sometimes wants us to be trapped, needs us to be trapped in a cave, whatever setting it is, in order for us to discover new things that we wouldn't have discovered otherwise? That God in that theology would still play a role in making sure that yes, God is playing a role in why we are in the place we are as a society and as individuals. And yet God is doing that because through that experience, we learn something new about ourselves, just like Shimon ben Yochai learned something new about himself when he's in the cave and finally comes to the realization that he should go out and experience that newness. Um, is this that Yochai, Shimon, is the bird freed from the possibility of getting caught in the trap? That we are all, or that we are all in a trap, and that we must look to be freed. That this is not necessarily about God controlling us, but maybe that voice is the voice within ourselves that is saying, free yourself. Do not become trapped. Do not stay trapped. Do not hide in the cave. Our tradition is saying, I think, in this story, the cave is not the place where you're supposed to belong, at least in the Jerusalem Talmud version. The Babylonian Talmud, interestingly enough, seems to suggest that there is a deepening of mystic resonance that comes with being in the cave. And yet here, this version, the Yerushalmi version, seems to indicate being in the cave is not the place to be, right? We even have the words that suggest that, hidden in the cave, as opposed to going into the cave and belonging in the cave. The hiddenness, the fact that his body rusts and then he must come forth. There are negative connotations of what it means to be trapped in the cage, but where you find freedom is when you emerge from that cave. God is declaring that Shimon is free and not the bird, that all of us have this opportunity to find that freedom, that we have to listen to the voice within us that is saying, free yourself, free our society, bring about that newness, bring about change, do things differently, do not get trapped. So those are a few of the things that came out for me from the story. But really, what I'm taking away is this idea that we're moving more into a different stage. And even if we are going to have to be safer at home again, because who knows what's going to happen with how these levels of the pandemic are going to swing up or down again, it doesn't really matter in my mind. I think in some ways we are now used to this and we can do it for longer if we need to. But more so, I think about that the society around us is starting to change. The way in which people are understanding what needs to happen, what things can't stay the same, that we can't rust any longer, individually and collectively. This has been the time in the cave where we, and if you haven't done enough of this, to really find that space to really be working on ourselves. And we're already talking at the synagogue about high holidays. You may not be thinking about it, but all of us who are Jewish professionals are already planning out high holidays. And it's not that far away. And this is almost the most incredible time to be working on ourselves leading up to the high holidays. That this high holidays is our chance to emerge from the spiritual caves that we've been in, not just because of safer at home, but potentially because of years of being trapped in the wheel of how things have gone in our life. And all of a sudden, boom, that was all put on pause. We were stuck at home, and now we need to reemerge. And so the rust may be the rust that you're feeling from being trapped in your home for many weeks, but maybe what we're feeling is the rust of what has been the same for so long. And now is our chance to open up our eyes in a new way and go out and see things anew. So those are a few of my thoughts from this text. And now, of course, I would love to hear your questions, your comments. One question already. Doug asks, is the cave of carobs in Truma significant? Um, Good question. Carob trees find themselves in a lot of these rabbinic stories. We found it, of course, in the Babylonian version of the story, Babylonian Talmud version. We found it in this. I think the story that I'm going to teach next week also talks about carob trees. They were native to the land of Israel, and so they were something that people could connect to and they knew about. Um, Again, they are also, think about, they're an alternative to cocoa, like carob bars. They don't taste as good, of course, but there's something that can be that is used by the carob, and we can create from the carob that is a delicacy. So I think I don't know if truma is important or not. It might be. Um, that would be interesting. I think it's more to try and geographically represent where this cave is, since in Israel there are caves. In the research that I did also about Babylonia, there it was a more muddy type of environment. There weren't as many caves that you would find. If you go to Israel today, of course, you find all kinds of ancient caves everywhere. So there, maybe it's more of just a placeholder to know where in the geography we were. But I think the tree, if we think about a carob tree, if we think about the tree itself, um, Eitz Chaim, the passage that we say every time during the Torah service, it is a tree of life. There is a strong correlation between a tree and the Torah, the strength of the roots, the rootedness that comes from a tree, what it means to be grounded, um, and that when you're living in a cave for a long period of time, you are grounding yourself in that land, in that earth, and yet the roots are only half of the tree, right? The roots are deep, they go deep into the ground, but the other half that we see, there is, I think, the way I am looking at it today is the hiddenness and what is visible. And that the tree represents that there is a visible part of that tree, and that the fruit of the tree is something that we tend to see overtly. And yet, the real significance of how a tree survives is found in its roots. And that the roots for some trees go as deep as the tree is tall above ground, right? So to think about the network that is established, the hiddenness of the network that exists under the ground, and within each one of us, there is a complete network. It's not just one root, right? There are the tentacles of the roots. There is the complexity of the human condition, and that we have to recognize, and we need to be developing and growing that root system, not just so the outside world can see the tree, but for its own sustainability. If we want to sustain who we are, and we want to continue to grow as individuals, which is the Jewish way of understanding the human condition, we must always grow and change, then you have to be taking care of that root system as well. So that's one thought. Merle, hi Merle.
Hi. So you're talking about rust and rust in our bodies from being confined and for sitting, etc. People with health issues, myself included, but not horrible or visible health issues, really have had a hard time with this because we're not getting the kind of stimulation that we normally get by being out walking, doing things that require being in public. And your body does become rusty, as you would say, and you have to keep redefining ways in order to become unrusty. And it's very difficult and it's very frustrating. And a lot of people don't realize that. They think, oh, you're home and you can do all these classes or you can do all these craft projects and clean out closets and everything else, but that really doesn't settle the issues that people have. The other aspect of that rust is people in nursing homes that can't see their families or their friends. They become very rusty and very stagnant. And it's very difficult for them and for their minds, as well as on the other side for their families. So I just thought I'd add that to the rust part of the conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's so important to recognize that those who are home, it's not like everyone is just sitting at home happy and healthy. That all of the underlying rust that may have existed before that could be sloughed off by going out into the world, right? Those underlying physical or emotional um, challenges that exist for so many people and for so many families are even more so during this time, and that we can't forget that is the rust. Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that. Jeff, hey Jeff.
This seems to be an entire story based on the ability or lack of it of the mind itself. And the idea that ideas that persist unchallenged, that without human and or interpersonal contact, the mind is stagnated and it's always in a cave unless you seek out change, movement, and growth. And to be in a cave, whether real or imagined, of the mind is an abhorrent thought to God to begin with. We know that change must continue and growth must continue, and you cannot remain trapped within your own self or mind or set of ideas specifically as it relates to your concept that we need to form positive change during this particular time in our history and the relationship within our society. So that without getting out, interfacing with what is, you have no growth, you have stagnation, and it's as if you were in a cave, and that is abhorrent to God.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Yes, great point, right? The whole way in which we are supposed to study Torah is like this, right? You're not supposed to sit at home by yourself with the text and trying to interpret it on your own. That's one of the biggest no-nos in studying Jewishly. Studying Jewishly is through dialogue, that it's a dialogue, just like prayer is a dialogue between us and God and really between us and ourselves, that the entire way in which we grow is through conversation, and is through connection and through relationships. And if you are missing that, you can't grow and others can't grow, and you diminish your ability, and it's another form of rusting, right? And when you rust at a certain point, you just can't move and you get stuck in your ways. And one of the biggest problems we are facing right now is people stuck in their ways, and it's getting more and more challenging for people to be able to engage in conversations where they can break out of that rust, see a new perspective. They don't need to agree, but if we are missing those opportunities, we're missing what it means to be living a Jewish life and living in a world where we can bring more meaning and purpose to the world in which we live. We can't do that if we are only stuck in our ways, planted firmly into the cave and not opening ourselves up to what else is out there. So thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate that. Gary. Hi, Gary.
Had to unmute. Hi.
Hi.
So my thoughts along the lines of structure, that we live our normal lives in structure. And I think that if we don't have structure in these lives that we're living now because of COVID, then we get stuck and rusted. So I think it's important for us to go out and, communicate with certain people on a regular basis. So, once a month, I'm a former temple executive director, and I set up a call with, 65 retired executives around the country. And once a month we get together on Zoom for a conversation. And everybody is like coming out of their shells because of that, and I think knowing I have 1 o'clock Talmud study with you on Thursdays, or 12 o'clock on Fridays with Steve, or whatever I do with my friends, to try to get out of that rusted conversation. I think the challenge of that is I've got a chavara that I've been together with for 45 years, and we're all camp counselors at Hess Kramer together, and we're doing it by Zoom, and it's just not the same thing. You're not getting the same out of it once a month that we do when we're in person.
Yeah, good point. And by the way, former executive director. This is, I don't know if you're happy that you're a former and not in the process of being an executive director during this time, or if be curious offline to talk to you about.
I'd love to do that.
But yes, thank you, Gary. You bring up really important points that yes, there is something, right? We're still missing something when we can't physically be together, like your hover, Gary, where you can't physically be together, and Zoom is not the best alternative. It works for now. It's not going to work forever. And the need to get out of that rut, to stay safe, and also recognize that we are a physical people, right? And even in the story, we have this idea that the imagery is really a lot about physicality, the rusting, the going out and emerging, seeing the hunter who's doing physical things, the bird that's flying, this idea of freedom, which is really not just mental freedom. It really is about a whole physical freedom that we're all yearning for. And that in this case, on the most basic level of the story, is a man who is freeing himself from the trappings of being in a cave to physically free himself out into the world and to go find anew. So yes, it's such a challenging time where we are having all these different forces. And we can imagine that Shimon also, after 13 years, that maybe part of the reason he sat at the mouth of that cave is because there is a fear of how do we come back out into that world? How do we do that in a way in which, if the world is different, which it is, it always is, how are we going to navigate that? And that's not easy. And we each have to go through our own process individually and sometimes as a family unit to figure out, what does that look like? What does success look like as we emerge? How do I want to define success? How do I want to understand my own limitations so that I don't go too far or so that I feel comfortable? How do I do that in a way where I'm not judging others who are doing things different from me? Because I'm starting to notice that a lot too, right? There's a lot of judgment that's starting to come out, and that's natural. But I think we just have to be aware of that. I think that's another potential trap that the hunter is placing for us, that fights against freedom. Judgment is one of those things that when we fall into the trap of judgment, we continue then to close our minds, to close our conversations, and potentially become rusted once again, or to stay rusted. And this is a time where we can't do that. Really, this is, I think, a significant turning point for us as a society, for us to not fall into that trap. So I urge you to really think about, whether internally or when you're talking to your close friends, what are statements of judgment? When are you asking questions of interest to try and understand a different perspective? And if you disagree with something, it's fine to say, I don't agree with that approach to coming out of, out of this pandemic or out of quarantine. But there's certain ways in which you can have those conversations. So I just urge you to be aware that you don't fall into one of those traps as well. Miriam. Hi, Miriam.
Okay, I do not see my picture, and I don't see anybody else's picture today. I see
You
you
don't.
on.
You're only stuck with my face. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. I thought there was something wrong with my
Nope, it's just a different
computer.
Zoom
I
format.
thought,
That's
no,
all.
but your face is beautiful, and I don't mind that. You said very important things today, Rabbi, and I feel that 100 other people should be listening to you at the moment. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good. And what you said was more than important, it was vital. And so from all these wonderful concepts that I'm taking from you today, and I very much find the word rust extremely operative, because as we get older, even young people tend to rust, and they stay in yesteryear when they don't have to. And rust is something that never gets better by itself. It only needs help to take off the rust and therefore begin somewhat anew. So what I'm taking from this on a very personal level is that I no longer can remain silent. I've never been silent. I've been an activist all my life. And I would be standing with all the 10,000 protesters if my children said that no way are their parents going to be standing in their 90s at a protest meeting. So they did, and my grandchildren did instead. But what I'm taking more than a personal level is you're asking us, you're pleading with us to no longer be the silent people we were. We saw a murder committed before our very eyes, and we no longer can be silent about that. Every one of us has to emerge from our cave, from our COVID cave confinement, three alliterative C's that I'm finding, COVID cave confinement, and we all can no longer remain people of silence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miriam. I really appreciate your comments and your feedback. Thank you. And I think another really important point that you raise is that, you talked about rust doesn't go away by itself. And I think another really key element that you're raising for us is to think about that we're not supposed to do all this alone. Now, the story is about a man on his own journey alone, and he almost does have a relationship with this bird, so to speak, but one of the missing elements is the fact that he is alone. And I think that's another teaching that we have to be aware of. We're not supposed to go through this by ourselves in isolation, right? Again, just like the cave represents isolation, we need to be a part of a system and a cohort that can help us take away that rust. So I really also urge you to make sure that you are engaging in those relationship buildings and having some of these conversations with other people who maybe you otherwise wouldn't have these types of conversations about what's going on with yourself or the world. but recognizing that this relational element that is also required. So thank you, Miriam. I really appreciate it. Susan. Hi, Susan. Susan, can you?
I have a few caveats, which people might not like to hear, and then I have some questions.
Okay.
One is the word change. And change is not always for the best. Look what happened in Germany with the Holocaust. There was, before the Holocaust, with the Nazis coming to power. Look at other regimes that there were dictators coming to power, and that was change, but it was not for the good. It was worse. So I would say maybe a better word might be growth that has a more positive, and everything changes. Heraclitus said you can't step into the same river at the same time. So
Right.
there's, I mean, that's, you know, that's part of breathing and being alive. The other thing is judgment. I don't know that suspending judgment is always a positive thing. What about, and one of the things is I'm thinking of people who don't wear masks. Am I not supposed to judge and say, oh, you know, this is freedom, let them not wear masks? Or I'm supposed to say, you know, this is not for the good of society or for others. So judgmental is a different thing, but judging, I think Judaism judges too. This is moral behavior, this is immoral behavior. So I think that's when we don't judge, we're ceding responsibility. The other thing is for quarantine that we're currently in. Again, I'm not sure it's all bad. When we get through with this and we do have contacts at the temple again, would you consider doing these Talmud tales continuously on Zoom, which I think would be a good thing? Susan Nanis' studies, and I'm going to some at Stephen Wise. I'm going to more study sessions than ever before because I don't have to drive and face the traffic. My husband has more clients that he's ever had before, and they're thrilled not to have to face the traffic. So there are some, thanks to technology. And the other thing, I ask if 13 is something, that's the year for bar mitzvah, for transitioning from childhood to adulthood, and they make a point of the 13th. So I thought maybe that was symbolic. And the last thing, if not for the will of heaven, the double negative, a bird would not get trapped. It was hard for me to get my mind around that with the double negatives, but wouldn't that suggest, I mean, I'm thinking maybe it suggests that God could, what you had said, plays a role in our lives, and what we think might be bad might be an opportunity for learning, for a shift in perspective, as you said, and may have some positive results, although we think it's bad. I did a handful.
I thank you. I always love your thoughts. Thank you, Susan. I want to try and address a couple of them. One, I think you're right. We are not judgment-free in our tradition, but there's a difference between seeing something that you disagree with and how you respond with your judgment and whether or not you're judgmental. And I think that's what I was referring to. It's not that we shouldn't judge and say, oh, everyone can just do what they want to do, and I'm not in a position to have my own opinion or to feel strongly about something. It's about how we talk about that, how we address that I think is really important. There are different ways of doing that, and there are ways that are more productive than others. So, but yes, you make a very good point. Again, also, you're right. Change is inevitable, and growth is not necessarily inevitable. And I think the challenge for all of us is, with change that comes all the time, how do we make sure change is that of growth, that change leads to growth and doesn't lead to rusting, that change is an opportunity for us to take advantage of for personal growth and collective growth, and that's really significant. So yes, change is going to happen, but can we grow from that change? And yes, of course, being in quarantine and being in these places have given us as a society and given us individually opportunities that didn't exist before. I mean, I'm also doing more learning than I was doing before. I mean, all the running around and the type of lifestyle that I was living as a rabbi, now I'd say I'm probably working harder, and yet there are spaces that have opened up for themselves that have allowed me to learn more than I have ever learned before. And part of that is we got a dog, so now I get to walk the dog twice a day in the morning and at night, and I listen to study sessions and podcasts during that, or I call family members. There's just a whole abundance of ways in which we are growing and thriving in this. And I think, as you also, maybe you or someone else mentioned, yes, we have to not just go back to the way things were, that these kind of learning sessions need to continue even as we continue to move into the future, that we shouldn't necessarily go back to everything in person. That doesn't work the same. And there's benefits to this strategy and this approach that we need to maintain and hold on to. And I know we at the synagogue are thinking about that and are definitely going to be continuing to do certain things like this online through Zoom, even when the building is completely open and people can drive and fight the crazy LA traffic. Thank you. I know there were more comments, but it's been an hour, and so I really appreciate all the thoughts that were brought up. And all the comments, as always. Thank you, everyone who shared, Miriam and Merle and Susan and Jeff and Doug, and I don't remember, there were other people as well. So thank you all. Have a wonderful Shabbat this weekend, and I look forward to studying with you again next Thursday, 1 p.m. Feel free to tell your friends, and look forward to future discussions, and wishing you all the best. And I know there are some visitors, so you are always welcome. Our doors are always open, so feel free to come back anytime, no matter where you live and what city. Look forward to seeing you again soon. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Have a great weekend. Bye.